The surviving punishment register from Catford Central School for Boys, London, England, provides a rare opportunity to examine the administration of corporal punishment within a British secondary school during the 1950s. Rather than relying on personal recollections or anecdotal evidence, the register records individual punishments, offences, dates, ages, and the number of strokes administered. This makes it possible to identify consistent disciplinary practices and to examine whether punishments followed recognisable patterns. Although the overall volume of canings initially appears high, closer examination reveals a more nuanced picture. The records suggest that punishments were not administered randomly, but instead reflected several identifiable considerations, including the pupil's age, the seriousness of the offence, and whether the pupil had previously been punished. Punishment by age. Table 2 provides insight into both the frequency and severity of canings across different age groups. One noticeable feature is the reduced number of entries for 16-year-olds. This is almost certainly explained by the fact that relatively few pupils remained at school beyond that age, resulting in a smaller sample rather than a reduction in disciplinary activity. Several clear trends emerge from the data. The most common punishment by a considerable margin was 2 strokes, accounting for approximately 56% of all recorded canings. 1 stroke represented around 24% of punishments, while the frequency of 3 or more strokes declined progressively as the number of strokes increased. This suggests that the school generally favoured moderate punishments, reserving heavier canings for more serious or repeated misconduct. Among 11-year-old boys, over half of all punishments consisted of a single stroke. Approximately 54% of canings in this age group were limited to 1 stroke, indicating that younger pupils were generally treated more leniently. This may reflect an intention to establish discipline early, while recognizing that new pupils were still adjusting to the school's expectations. For many boys, a single caning appears to have been considered sufficient to reinforce acceptable behavior. One remarkable exception stands out. An 11-year-old boy, recorded elsewhere in the register, received 13 separate canings, making him a clear statistical outlier whose behavior differed dramatically from that of the majority of his contemporaries. Increasing severity with age. Perhaps the clearest trend shown in the data is the relationship between age and punishment severity. As pupils became older, they were increasingly likely to receive larger numbers of strokes. Only 46% of 11-year-olds received 2 or more strokes during a punishment, whereas this figure rose steadily with each successive age group until reaching 94% among 16-year-olds. A similar progression can be observed for punishments involving 3 or more strokes and 4 or more strokes. The increase is sufficiently consistent to suggest that age itself formed an important component in determining punishment. This pattern probably reflected the belief that older boys bore greater personal responsibility for their behavior and therefore deserved more severe disciplinary measures when they failed to meet expected standards. The records also show that the most severe punishments generally began to appear only from the age of 13 onwards. 4 and 6 stroke canings are rare among younger boys but become increasingly common among older pupils. Truancy illustrates this particularly well. Before the age of 14, isolated cases of truancy generally attracted comparatively moderate punishments. From 14 onwards, however, truancy almost invariably resulted in the maximum punishment of 6 strokes, suggesting that persistent absence from school was regarded as one of the gravest disciplinary offences. Frequency of canings. Per boy table. 3 demonstrates that repeated corporal punishment was relatively uncommon. Approximately 45% of boys who were caned experienced the punishment only once during the period covered by the register. Around 65% received only 1 or 2 canings, while roughly 3/4 were never punished more than 3 times. These figures suggest that, for most pupils, corporal punishment was an infrequent event rather than a routine aspect of school life. Whether this indicates that caning functioned as an effective deterrent remains open to interpretation. However, The statistics do suggest that the majority of boys did not repeatedly commit offences serious enough to warrant further corporal punishment. At the opposite end of the scale was a very small group of persistent offenders. Approximately 5% of canned boys were punished 9 or more times, while only 3 pupils, representing roughly 0.5% of all boys who were caned, received 20 or more separate canings. These individuals accounted for a disproportionately large share of the entries in the punishment register. Persistent offenders. The register indicates that certain serious offences, particularly truancy, were concentrated among a relatively small number of repeat offenders. In these cases, corporal punishment appears to have produced only temporary improvements in behaviour before further offences occurred. An interesting observation emerges when comparing the intervals between repeated punishments. Contemporary accounts suggest that a severe 6-stroke caning could leave bruising that lasted for as long as 2 weeks. Although impossible to prove from the records alone, it is notable that many repeat offences occurred only after a period broadly corresponding with the expected healing time. The most striking exception concerns a 14-year-old boy who received 6 strokes for truancy on 18th November 1954 and then committed the same offence again only 4 days later, receiving another 6-stroke punishment on 22nd November. While this single example cannot support broader conclusions, it illustrates that even the maximum available punishment did not always prevent immediate reoffending. Group punishments. Most entries concern either individual pupils or very small groups involved in the same incident. Occasionally, however, considerably larger groups were punished together. These incidents generally related to academic rather than behavioural failings, particularly poor effort or failure to complete assigned work. One recorded example involved 9 15-year-old boys from the same classroom, each receiving 2 strokes for failing to complete their work satisfactorily. Notably, no examples were found of an entire class receiving corporal punishment simultaneously. Even in group cases, punishment appears to have been restricted to those directly involved. Escalation following previous canings. Another pattern became apparent during examination of the register, although it is less obvious in the numerical summaries alone. Pupils receiving their first caning often appeared to benefit from a degree of leniency. First offences frequently resulted in a single stroke, particularly among younger boys. Once a pupil had previously been caned, however, subsequent offences often attracted larger punishments. Examples occur repeatedly among 11 and 12-year-olds, who commonly received 1 stroke for an initial offence, but 2, or occasionally more, for later offences of similar seriousness. This suggests that previous disciplinary history formed an important consideration when deciding the number of strokes to administer. Escalation for repeated misconduct. The register also indicates that repeated commission of the same offence frequently resulted in progressively harsher punishment. One particularly clear example involved 2 14-year-old boys punished with 3 strokes each for copying schoolwork. Only 2 days later, they repeated exactly the same offence. This time, both boys received 4 strokes. No further entries for copying were subsequently recorded for either pupil, suggesting that the increased punishment may have achieved its intended effect, although the records naturally cannot confirm the reason. The broader pattern nevertheless indicates that escalating punishment formed part of the school's disciplinary philosophy, with repeated misconduct generally attracting progressively greater severity. Types of offences. The offences recorded in the register are broadly typical of those found in mid-20th century British schools. Most relate to everyday disciplinary matters, including disobedience, failure to complete assignments, poor quality work, truancy, bullying, vandalism, talking during assembly, smoking climbing school, buildings or structures entering prohibited areas. Occasionally, more unusual entries appear. One 12-year-old boy, for example, received 3 strokes for participating in what was recorded simply as a disgusting game in the lavatory. Unfortunately, the register provides no further explanation of the incident. Conclusions. Taken as a whole, the register suggests that corporal punishment at Catford Central School for Boys followed identifiable and relatively consistent patterns rather than being administered arbitrarily. Although the school averaged approximately 3 canings per school day, the majority of pupils experienced corporal punishment only once or twice during their time at the school. The typical punishment consisted of 2 strokes administered to the seat, with substantially heavier punishments reserved for older boys, repeat offenders, or more serious offences. 3 principal factors appear to have influenced the severity of punishment: the age of the pupil, which was the strongest predictor of the number of strokes; the seriousness of the offence, with truancy consistently attracting the harshest penalties; previous disciplinary history, with repeat offenders generally receiving progressively heavier punishments. The consistency of these relationships suggests that punishments were not determined solely by the immediate offence, but formed part of a broader disciplinary framework in which staff exercised discretion according to established expectations. The register also highlights a very small group of persistent offenders who accumulated exceptionally large numbers of canings. In particular, boys receiving more than 20 canings over a relatively short period raise important questions. In such cases, corporal punishment clearly failed to produce lasting behavioural change, suggesting that other underlying educational, social, or personal factors may have been contributing to their repeated misconduct. Viewed statistically, the register portrays a disciplinary system that relied heavily upon corporal punishment, but employed it with recognisable gradations of severity. Whether that system was effective or justified remains a matter of historical interpretation, but the surviving records provide valuable evidence of how school discipline was administered in practice during this period.